Okay, thank you, Chuck. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lydia Wegman. I'm one of the co-deans of the EPA Alumni Academy, along with Dave Ulrich. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and particularly our panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, the time you're going to spend with us today. Before we begin, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The first is that we will have breakout sessions after the panelists are done speaking and the program is over. For anybody who wants to socialize with old friends or meet some new alumni friends. And Chuck will explain how that will work after our program is over. I also want to let you know that we have arranged for our first climate change session with the Academy. It will be on January 26th, and our speaker will be Dan Esty. He is a former EPA employee who has gone on to greater glory, working at Yale University in the law school, and as well as the School for the Environment. And he is actually currently at the COP26, so he will be able to talk to us both about Glasgow and about the work he's been doing since leaving EPA. So on to today's program. Today, our panelists will discuss the ongoing restoration of the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in North America. This is the biggest watershed restoration project ever undertaken in the United States. It is being done under a Clean Water Act total maximum daily load process, which will be discussed by our panelists. And they will describe its key elements in the first 10 years of implementation. And they will discuss both the successes and the challenges and the lessons learned that might be useful for watershed restorations elsewhere in the country. Our moderator today is Ridgeway Hall. Ridge has been working on Clean Water Act matters for over 45 years. Ridge served as Associate General Counsel for Water at EPA from 1975 to 77. He was a founding partner with the law firm of Crowell and Mooring in Washington, D.C., where he also started the firm's environmental practice. For the past 11 years, Ridge's work has focused on the restoration of the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. He is currently the vice chair of the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, a group that provides free legal services on cases involving the protection and restoration of the bay and its resources. So Ridge, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for managing our program today.
You bet, Lydia. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Lydia said, we're going to talk about the Chesapeake Bay restoration. And to repeat a couple of things she said, it is the biggest watershed restoration ever undertaken in the United States. And it is based on the biggest total maximum daily load, or TMDL, ever issued under the Clean Water Act. Think of the TMDL as a pollution diet that can't be exceeded without bad things happening. Let me introduce my co-panelists here. Each member of our panel has been deeply involved in the restoration effort, and each was selected because of his or her special expertise relevant to this program. First of all, we wanted somebody who really knows the Chesapeake Bay program and the science on which the TMDL was built. Rich Batiuk spent 33 years with the Chesapeake Bay program as Associate Director for Science, Analysis, and Implementation. He has been in charge, was in charge of the science underlying the TMDL and the efforts and strategy surrounding its initial implementation. Now he's got his own consulting firm, Coastwise Partners, which I think he set up to allow a little extra time for kayaking and hiking. Next, the focus of the restoration is on three pollutants: nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. Because agricultural runoff is the biggest source of these three pollutants, we wanted an expert on farming and the challenges farmers face in reducing this pollution. Bobby Whitescarver is a Virginia farmer who spent 31 years with the Agriculture Department's Natural Resources Conservation Service. He then founded Whitescarver Natural Resources Management to help farmers get the job done using conservation and best management practices. The farm sector, I should tell you, is especially important because that's where we get the most cost-effective reduction of nitrogen and phosphorus. Matter of fact, a few years ago, Bobby wrote a wonderful blog article called "Why Don't Farmers Just Do It?" A lot of us have been asking that recently, and Bobby's here to discuss that with us. Third, we wanted somebody who, well, first of all, Pennsylvania has fallen behind the other states, and that's jeopardized the success of the restoration. So we wanted somebody who really is familiar with Pennsylvania and the problems they've been encountering. Marel King is the Pennsylvania director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. She works at the heart of Pennsylvania's challenges and the efforts to develop solutions. She's got a degree in high honors with agricultural economics and was captain of the two-time national champion Holstein Dairy Quiz Bowl team. So with that, here's how we're going to proceed. First of all, I'm going to just take a few minutes and give you some key facts, an overview, so they'll all have a common basis of knowledge on which we will then proceed to a conversational format in which we'll discuss some of the key issues and challenges of the programs, and we're going to save time for questions at the end. Feel free to submit questions through the chat box as we go along. I'll try to take any red hot questions as we go, but we'll do our best to get to all of them at the Q&A session at the end. So here we go. The Chesapeake Bay is, as you heard at the outset, is the biggest estuary in North America. It covers part of Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and DC. The population of this area is 18 million people. It's also home to more than 3,500 varieties of fish, shellfish, birds, and plants. It's famous for its blue crabs and oysters, sailboats, and watermen. It's also a multi-billion-dollar driver of the mid-Atlantic economy. That includes commercial and recreational fishing, shipping, tourism, farming, and other industries. But several centuries of industrial and residential development has resulted in severe pollution. As I mentioned a minute ago, the pollutants causing this problem is nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, and that's been the focus of our restoration. But as a result of that pollution, oysters are at 1% of their historic high. Blue crabs and striped bass are struggling. The water in many areas of the watershed is murky and low on oxygen. The biggest sources of these three pollutants is farming and contaminated urban and suburban stormwater. The big challenges these pose for EPA arises from the fact that, with limited exceptions, almost all of this is non-point source pollution. That means it's not subject to permitting under the Clean Water Act and largely exempt from EPA's regulatory reach under the Clean Water Act. That means that regulation of these operations is left to the states, and that has been spotty. The initial efforts to curb this pollution began back in 1983, when the Bay States met with EPA to develop the necessary science to launch a cleanup effort, and pollution reduction measures were launched by the states on a state-by-state basis. They were largely voluntary, and they were almost entirely unsuccessful. One of the principal obstacles to the effort was the fact that there's no interstate enforcement mechanism. Maryland and Virginia have no authority to go up and tell farmers to stop polluting the Susquehanna River. And yet the Susquehanna River dumps 50% of the freshwater load into the Chesapeake Bay every day. So in 2007, the Bay States asked EPA to develop an interstate TMDL under the Clean Water Act. And they agreed that EPA would allocate the pollution burdens, that's the cleanup burdens, based on the contribution, the volumetric contribution of each state. And in 2010, EPA issued that TMDL. It required a reduction of annual discharges of nitrogen by 25%, phosphorus by 24%, and sediment by 20% using a 2009 baseline, and get that done by 2025. That's a huge lift. The TMDL had a novel accountability framework. No TMDL has ever done this before. And the four components of it are as follows. First was the timing sequence. Each state has to have in place the necessary measures to reduce the pollutants in targeting the 2025 reduction goals. 60% of those in place by 2017 and 100% by 2025. Second, watershed implementation plans. Each state had to and has, in fact, developed its own watershed implementation plan, or WIP. The WIP includes regulations, laws, strategies, enforcement measures manpower and funding requirements, everything it needs to get the job done in meeting those water quality goals. Third, 2-year milestones. Every 2 years, each state submits to EPA a 2-year milestone plan in which it outlines what it plans to accomplish in the next 2 years and reviews what it's done in the previous 2 years. These are published by EPA on its website. It's a great way, or it's designed to be a great way, and I think it's been pretty effective in making sure that each state is making reasonable further progress towards achieving the 2025 water quality goals. Finally, backstops. The TMDL itself is not an enforceable document. It's a planning document. Now, the permits and regulations that are issued under the TMDL to implement it, those are enforceable, but the TMDL document itself is not. However, EPA has some sanctions it can impose if the states fail to do their fair share of making progress under their WIP or the 2-year milestones. These include tougher permit requirements on the point sources that do require permits by EPA or state authorized program, tougher requirements on any new or expanded point source. They can step up federal oversight. And finally, EPA can impose conditions on federal funding under the Clean Water Act. That's awfully important. This has been a multi-billion-dollar undertaking, as I'm sure you can appreciate. The states have the lead in the implementing their watershed implementation plans. EPA has 3 key roles in the process. The most important, in my view, is acting as a referee, making sure that all 7 of the Bay jurisdictions do their share of the overall TMDL in making further progress forward. The second is providing funding under the Clean Water Act, and the third is the scientific studies done for all the Bay states to support what they're doing. The implementation work itself is coordinated by the Chesapeake Bay program partners. Now that consists of the governors of each state, the mayor of DC, the administrator of EPA, and the head of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, Marel's organization. Rich is going to describe that Bay program, how it operates, what it is, in just a couple of minutes. But at this point, I will simply say to you that it has been absolutely essential to the success of the restoration. I'll also add that the initiative has spawned a whole lot of undertakings by the private and NGO sectors. People who never used to get out and participate in things like trash pickup, stream bank revegetation, tree plantings, they're all getting out and doing those kinds of things. The NGO community has heavily targeted their funds towards the most cost-effective pollution reduction technologies. We've had a lot of successes, but there are big challenges ahead. And we're going to discuss those challenges as well as what lessons might be learned for future watershed restorations around the country. And to lead it off, Rich, would you tell us about the Chesapeake Bay program and how it works?
Certainly. Thank you, Ridge. So folks, I want to, in introducing the Chesapeake Bay program, I'm going to first talk about the partnership and then the Chesapeake Bay program office, 2 distinct but linked things. So first, for the Chesapeake Bay program partnership. So envision a large tent, think of it maybe a circus tent. And underneath that tent, you've got about 800 different individuals reflecting the full array of different partners from our state, 6 states in the district, to 20 different federal partners that are out there, but folks from business, from the academic community, from local governments. So essentially somebody that would have a role in some kind of stream to restoration, fisheries work, et cetera, is represented underneath that large tent. And then underneath this tent, all these 800 different partners actually have a set established of governance procedures, how they're working together, what table they sit at, how they can make decisions, where their decisions are going to go as those, or recommendations go as well. So there is an organizational structure, a governance structure that folks understand that once they're under their tent, they have a role and responsibility, but they're going to be part of the decision-making process, whether it's in fisheries or in land conservation issues, water quality issues. Regardless, they're going to have an opportunity to directly engage in that and be part of that consensus building. But then this management structure is pretty complex. Think of a major corporation where you've got the 6 governors, the mayor of the District of Columbia, the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, essentially being our board of directors. We refer to them as the Chesapeake Executive Council. They set, the big picture for this group, meeting annually, agreeing to policies, agreements over time. They were actually established back in 1984 when the partnership first began. Underneath them, we're fortunate to have the state cabinet secretaries from natural resources to those dealing with transportation issues, water quality issues, even planning issues that depending on the particular state, and their federal counterparts. So we've got cabinet level, state and federal partners at the table directly working with the governors, the mayor, and the chair of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Then at the hub of this partnership is what we call the management board. It's chaired actually by the director of the Chesapeake Bay Program office itself in Annapolis, who I was a part of for 33 years there. That person not only manages the office itself, but really manages the core of the partnership, getting policy direction from above, and then working with a series of what we call goal implementation teams that deal from fisheries to stewardship to land use issues and water quality as well. So they're on a monthly basis, on a day-to-day basis, managing this 800 scheme management structure that you've got in there as well. And then, as I mentioned underneath there, you've got folks that are representing more programmatic and technical issues. Again, from the full array of businesses and academic partners out there, non-governmental organizations, state, federal, local partners as well. So you've got this small myriad of the entire set of people that are going to be involved in restoration within this management structure. And then last but not least, we've actually got 3 advisory committees, one capturing local elected officials from townships and boroughs in Pennsylvania to cities and counties in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, across the 6 states in the district. We've got a scientific and technical advisory committee where we've got 40 members, again, representing the myriad of different universities out there. And then we've got a citizen advisory committee that reflects all the other interests in there, from the business, the industrial community, the non-governmental organizations as well. So they're all working together to guide the partnership, and it really has evolved significantly since it was first put in 1983. So that's the partnership. Let me turn to the Chesapeake Bay Program Office itself. So the 1983 agreement, that was a one-page agreement that essentially said the 3 states, Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, District of Columbia, would start working together. It actually called for the formation of an office that was eventually funded through Section 117 of the Clean Water Act. I don't refer to it as an EPA office, even though I was an EPA employee for 33 years. Why? Because only about a third of those colleagues at that office are actually EPA employees. Through grants, cooperative agreements, interagency agreements, and contracts, we had staff at the office drawn from partners like U.S. Geological Survey, National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA's natural NRCS as well. We had the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin. We had universities like University of Maryland, Virginia Tech, Penn State, Virginia Marine Science. We had non-governmental organizations like the Alliance for Chesapeake Bay. These were all employees drawn together at a common office, essentially working for that larger partnership out there. Yes, it was EPA funded, and yes, there were EPA employees there, but like myself, we actually all answered to the partnership. Whether we had a governor that might have been heading up the partnership at that particular point, a cabinet secretary, a nature conservancy state director, a university sea grant director, even Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, for example, if they had a leadership role in there, we were working for those particular partners. So this staff in Annapolis essentially was, again, a reflection of this larger partnership that was out there, and actually providing technical, policy, programmatic support. And collectively, we worked to make sure that the partnership was functioning in there. People like myself that also had an EPA role in there, I certainly had those set of responsibilities given the budget we had, but truly it was a partnership office supporting a larger, very complex partnership out there as well. So Rich, let me turn it back to you. That's sort of a big picture overview of first the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, and then I'm supporting that, the Chesapeake Bay Program Office in Annapolis.
That's a great lead off, Rich. And while Rich was talking, 2 links were posted in the chat box. One is the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program Office. A lot of what Rich covered, for those of you who want more information on that, you'll find it there, and EPA's TMDL, Chesapeake Bay TMDL website also. Rich, that's a terrific description, but you've got all these federal agencies, state agencies, advisory committee. How does it function? How does this all get pulled together? Who keeps the train moving down the tracks in a coordinated fashion?
Well, it's sort of individuals and everybody. So really from the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, with that first signing of that agreement in December of 1983, at the core of it, there was an understanding, even though EPA was at the table, we had some of the states, not all of them at that point, it was understood that this was a true partnership and decisions by this partnership would be made by consensus, by building up agreements and working through disagreements and specific language and moving forward on that. So over time, this group of partners developed organizational procedures. There's a governance document that's, I think, about 30+ pages that describes the different elements within our structure, but also talks about roles and responsibilities. So again, if you're under that big tent, you're one of those 800 people, whether you're a governor or a mayor of Eastern Maryland or a scientist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, where you're sitting at that table, you understand sort of how you fit in there, how you make decisions, how your information or your decisions are influencing what's happening above there as well, Ridge. So I think we've been blessed, but sort of from the beginning, the understanding that it's not an EPA program. It is really a state-driven program, but one that's got a large tent that involves everybody that's got to be involved in all parts of the watershed and estuarine restoration efforts.
You know, just to follow up on what Rich just said, there is one of the key bodies under this program is a thing called the Principal Staff Committee, and that's made up of the heads of each of the state environmental agencies. Now, their departments of, as Rich said, agriculture, natural resources, and so forth. But it's kind of like there were 7 quarterbacks of a team, and you say, well, how does it get done? There really has been remarkable success in terms of developing consensus. Nobody tries to get out front of somebody else. I think there's a sense that this is the last best chance to restore the biggest and most productive estuary in North America, and we're all in it together. So I've been impressed at the way the Principal Staff Committee and the others have been able to move it forward. Rich, a question came in already on performance metrics. What quantitative performance measures are being used by the Chesapeake Bay program and perhaps others to assess progress going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, one of the strengths that we've had over the decades, and actually started in 1987, when that agreement, which was larger than a single page and started to encompass other issues of water quality, started to actually adopt numerical restoration goals. That one started with water quality. It was a 40% reduction. So it started to add numbers to what we're trying to do there. So if you move forward to today, every year the partnership produces what they call the Bay Barometer, directed towards the interested public, and it lays out specific goals and how we're doing on things like oyster reef restoration, female crab population. So you male crabs out there, we really don't care about you. Concerned about acreages of underwater grasses, loads of nitrogen and phosphorus coming from the rivers, lands conserved, public access sites. So these are quantitative goals agreed to by not just the 6 states in the district, all the partners that are involved in here. And then other issues come under our 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, so that you also get measurements on things like stewardship and environmental literacy, as well as more recent goals on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Those can be found on the Chesapeake Bay Program's website. So one of the key pieces that the partnership has done is first numerical goals, and then Ridge and others, it's been very transparent, reporting to the public, good news, bad news, flat lines, hurricane-driven things, and good, and in fact, where we're actually making progress against a pretty significant human tide of folks coming into the Mid-Atlantic region.
There are also a couple of other organizations that monitor progress of the Bay. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has an annual report they put out. Rich just posted a link, or had some, I think a link is about to be posted if it hasn't already in the chat, about the University of Maryland's Center for Environmental Studies. They do a monitoring program looking at not only water quality, but the various habitat, the fish, how are the fish and the bay grass is doing and so forth. So there's a lot that's being done there. Well, we could spend a lot of time on the Bay program itself, but we're going to turn to another program, which the Bay program has been deeply involved with, and that's agriculture. I mentioned earlier that agriculture was the biggest source of the 3 pollutants of concern: nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. So I'm going to turn it over to Bobby. Bobby, what's going on in the ag sector? What are we doing well? What can we do better? What do we need?
Well, we don't have enough time to cover all that, but there's a lot going on. I just want to make a few opening statements. One, first of all, thank you all for having me here, and thanks everyone for joining in. My wife and I farm in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. We have 2 farms, and both of them have riparian buffers. We're getting ready to plant 3,000 trees on our new farm in Churchville. And the cost share programs in Virginia are robust. And as a matter of fact, I think last year we passed the largest BMP budget in our history with $73 million going to the state's cost share program. So if farmers in Virginia want to do something about water quality, especially about getting cattle out of streams, we have 8 different ways to do it, funding to do that. But let me back up and just say that forests cover most of the watershed, about 57% of the watershed. It's the largest land use, and it's the most important. And scientists think that we need to have 70% forest cover to have really a good chance at a restored bay. The second largest land use, as you so well articulated, Ridge, is agriculture. And it covers about 24% of the watershed, and it's the largest contributor of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. But farmland is also the most economical to treat for non-point source pollution. And that's why Virginia and some of the other states have invested a lot of money into helping farmers do the right thing. And in my opinion, the largest gains in nutrient and sediment reductions in the Bay watershed have come from 3 best management practices: cover crops on annual cropland, nutrient management, and riparian buffers. So those are where we've made the biggest gains.
Bobby, could you go into a little more detail on each of those 3? Because I think those are very important points. Cover crops, nutrient management, and riparian buffers. Those really have been key to a lot of the progress in the ag sector.
Well, I'll start with cover crops. That, in my opinion, that was the low hanging fruit. It's easy to sell cover crops on annual crop ground, and states have put money into helping farmers transition to cover crops. And, if you drive around in Virginia right now, I'd say that 90% of our annual crop ground has a cover crop on it. So we've come a long way with cover crops, and the cover crop best management practices have evolved, like all the other cost share programs, to, listen to farmers' needs and change as the weather changes and things change. Well, the cost share programs have changed too. Nutrient management, good grief, 30 years ago, nobody had nutrient management programs, and now we have robust nutrient management programs. All of the confined animal feeding operations in Virginia are required to not only have, but implement a nutrient management plan. Any farmer that receives cost share for cover crops has to have a nutrient management plan and implement it. Virginia has banned phosphorus in lawn fertilizer. And we've also, when you reach a certain level of soil phosphorus, you can't apply anymore, whether it's manure or commercial fertilizer. It is against our regulations to do that. Now, there was a lot of whining and belly aching about that, but that's the regulation now. So nutrient management, we've come a long way. And in riparian buffers, 30 years ago, NRCS didn't even have that as a practice. And now it is the most popular BMP on livestock farms. So we've come, full circle on riparian buffers, and also we encourage planting trees in those buffers, because if we have native trees in the buffers, we can get 2 to 8 times more cleansing power because the aquatic ecosystem can digest, can process in-stream pollution, whether it comes from the back end of a cow or a sewage treatment plant. So those 3 practices, and I'll mention no-till farming also, but those are the 3 biggies in my book.
So Bobby, why isn't, if these are the most cost-effective measures, best management practices, why aren't we just pouring most of our money into that? Are farmers not willing to do that? Is there already enough money, enough technical assistance out there? What's the bottleneck? Why aren't we doing more of that?
Well, that's a good question, Ridge. In my opinion, there's not enough technical assistance to handle the demand. We have the cost share dollars both in state and federal, but we have bottlenecks with engineering services, and to be honest, we have a lot of red tape. And we're going to talk later about some of the barriers. Why aren't more farmers doing it? Well, it's because we environmentalists have created processes that are kind of getting our way, getting our own way. So I would say that technical assistance and in other ways, for cover crops, for example, the way we're verifying that is it takes a lot of human power to do it, and we need to do it, by remote sensing, and this can be done. The people in the commons, it used to be the Chesapeake Commons, we have the technology to verify winter cover crops, and we ought to be doing that. As far as nutrients, I'd say that phosphorus, we have a huge distribution problem with phosphorus. We have a concentration of phosphorus in the poultry, where we have high concentration of poultry in Shenandoah Valley, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and the Eastern Shore. There are many farms, I'll say this, there are more farms that need phosphorus than have too much. And so it's a distribution problem. And well, it's more than a distribution problem. We could talk all day about big chicken, no land, but the big problem is we have too much phosphorus in manure in certain areas, and we need to get it out of there and put it where we need the phosphorus. We have a manure transport program in Virginia. In my opinion, it's not robust enough, and I think we need to put more resources into manure transport.
And Rich, Bobby's talking from a state like Maryland that's got a very robust cost share program, robust technical assistance. We've got several of the states that don't have that. And if you look at the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, our Bay pollution diet, we need to get to 80 to 90% of our farmers with a full suite of practices in place. When you have a conservation district that only has 3 or 4 technical assistance providers, you can't get there. So Bobby's right that we need to take what Virginia and Maryland are doing, getting it across the full 64,000 square miles, and we've got to be dealing with 80 to 90% of our almost 75,000 mainly family farms out there in order to get to a clean Chesapeake Bay.
Marel, what are you seeing up in Pennsylvania in this area?
As far as agriculture and technical assistance, absolutely, technical assistance is a limiting factor. And there's a lot of history involved with that, why the staffing levels are the way they are. But it's absolutely something we need to overcome. We need more financial assistance, but we also need the technical assistance to go along with it, for sure.
Bobby, before we leave agriculture, and you're right, we could spend the whole afternoon on it. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of the cultural and sociological issues? I mean, we know that farmers are an independent lot. They always have been, a proud crowd. Many the last person a farmer wants to talk to, for example, is a lawyer. Another farmer talking to a lawyer has a much better chance of persuading him to install a riparian buffer than I do. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of those kinds of cultural issues?
Sure. Well, I've always said that conservation is not science, it's sociology. How do you convince somebody to do something that they don't want to do? And so, it comes down to education and awareness first. And the goal for the field staff, if you will, the boots on the ground, is to get a seat at the kitchen table. And once you get there, once you build that trust, I think it's, pretty much smooth sailing. But breaking that, initial barrier is critical. And our sales force, and I call it a sales force because it is selling. Our sales force needs to open the farmer playbook and not the environmental playbook. I've never had a farmer come into my office and by the way, I'm a recovering bureaucrat. I spent 31 years with NRCS as a district conservationist, and I never had a farmer ask me, well, I need more pollinator corridor, or I need to sequester more carbon. They need more water distributed throughout the farm. They need an easier way to get the cows into the barnyard to work them. So if we can change our playbook, I think we could get along a lot quicker. And then there's other problems. We've created our own problems in that the processes to get a CREP contract, for example. I don't know if we want to, if everybody knows what the CREP program is, but that's the federal state partnership to put buffers along streams. And the processes have gotten so big, it's just, incredibly hard to explain all of it to the farmer. We need to make things simpler. And I'll give you an example. In NRCS, we have, because of NEPA, we have a 13-page document called the CPA 52 that the poor field people have to fill out to prove that a riparian buffer isn't going to harm the environment. And in my opinion, things like that we need to streamline. So farmers don't like red tape. They don't trust, government employees. And so we've got to break that barrier by building trust.
That's very helpful, Bobby. Let me kind of close out this part of the discussion by saying, I think you all can see there's tremendous opportunities with the agricultural sector. I mean, as we've said, this is the most cost-effective way to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus. There's a huge amount of agricultural land to install best management practices on. But the bottlenecks are such that I'm going to close out with an example, and that is earlier this year, Marel and her colleagues at the Chesapeake Bay Commission and I worked on some legislation in Maryland. Maryland has a thing called the Bay Restoration Fund, and we got an amendment passed that pulls out $20 million a year through 2030 from that fund to pay farmers to install best management practices. The simplest possible kinds of paperwork to describe what's needed, support to get technical assistance, but that's how big the need is, and that's where at least one state legislature put its money. We're going to turn now to the problems of Pennsylvania. Marel, Pennsylvania takes a lot of flack, I think, from the other states for how far behind it is, but I know in many quarters they would say that's not for want of trying, and there's a lot of opportunity there. Can you tell us what the situation is in Pennsylvania, what the problems are, and what the developing solutions seem to be?
Yeah, so thanks, Ridge. And for everyone's benefit, just quickly, the Chesapeake Bay Commission is a tri-state legislative commission. So as Rich mentioned, the commission is one of those members of the executive council. Our commission chair is a member of the executive council within the Bay program. The commission is one of the 9 signatories to the Bay Agreement. We are the only legislative branch. signatory to that agreement. So unlike the governors, the mayor, the EPA administrator representing the executive branch of government, the commission represents the legislative branch of government, and really, demonstrates the importance of, the appropriations and budget process, and the legislative policymaking part of how things get done. So governors do a lot, but legislatures play a very vital role as well. Each of our 3 state delegations is made up of 2 state senators, 3 state House members, a citizen member, plus the environmental secretary of that state. So again, very weighted toward the legislative side. And we are advisory, not regulatory in any way, but we are advisory to those general assemblies. So I staff the Pennsylvania delegation of the commission. And yes, as Ridge mentioned, Pennsylvania is behind on its goals, 34 million pounds behind on its nitrogen goal specifically, pretty much on track for phosphorus, thankfully, but nitrogen is really the big stumbling block in Pennsylvania. And just some fun facts about Pennsylvania. The Bay watershed is just one of 4 major watersheds in Pennsylvania. You also have the Ohio River, which of course flows into the Mississippi, the Delaware River, the Great Lakes watershed, and then the Chesapeake, which is both the Susquehanna and Potomac watersheds in Pennsylvania. And the Bay watershed is about 50% of the land area of Pennsylvania, but it's only about 30% of the population of Pennsylvania. And therein lies a lot of the political issues in making some more progress in Pennsylvania. The 2 major population centers, and therefore, the political power is outside of the watershed, Philly over in the Delaware Basin and Pittsburgh over in the Ohio Basin. And anything that we want to get done in Pennsylvania for the Bay really has to be part of a statewide initiative, a statewide approach. And we try not to talk too much about the Chesapeake, quite frankly. In Pennsylvania, sometimes I lament that I have Chesapeake in my title because we obviously have no bay shoreline. In Pennsylvania, it really is all about primarily the Susquehanna River and all the local tributaries. And it's really more than the Susquehanna River. It's even more about those local tributaries in Pennsylvania. Just another fun fact about Pennsylvania, we have over 2,500 local government units in Pennsylvania. So we are very parochial, very local when it comes to our policies, our decision-making, our sort of perspective. And it really is about your backyard creek. And that's how we have to develop our policies in Pennsylvania. And for better or for worse, it certainly is leverage in helping with the Bay. Almost 1/3 of those local streams are impaired on the 303D list in Pennsylvania. So it's not like we just have work to do for the Bay. We have a lot of work to do in Pennsylvania for those local rivers and streams. And that primarily has to be our focus, but doing it obviously within the context of the greater Chesapeake effort. We like to say up here that everything we do for local water quality will help the Bay in turn, and vice versa. If we're taking an action, if we're trying to enact a fertilizer law like Maryland and Virginia have for the Bay, that will also have local water quality benefits. So that's how we're approaching things. There is significant opportunity in Pennsylvania. I mentioned that the Susquehanna watershed right there in the lower Susquehanna, just north of the Maryland border, is Lancaster County. Lancaster County is the most productive non-irrigated farmland in the entire country. Lancaster County has more dairy cows, actually twice as many as the entire state of Maryland, 25% more than the entire state of Virginia, just in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The value of livestock and poultry in just Lancaster County is equal to all of Maryland, equivalent to all of Delaware's total ag output. And therefore, as you might expect, Lancaster is 21% of Pennsylvania's entire nutrient reductions of those 34 million pounds. Lancaster County alone is 21% of that. Lancaster County has to reduce over 11 million pounds of nitrogen under the latest version of our watershed implementation plan. All of Maryland only has to reduce another 8 million pounds. Even going back to the beginning of the TMDL, back in 2010, Lancaster County has to reduce more than all of Maryland. So it's all about agriculture primarily. And it's all about geography. But again, that provides a lot of opportunities to really focus our efforts, structure our existing and especially our new programs toward agriculture and toward the geographies and the practices that make the most sense. We definitely need more funding in Pennsylvania for sure. Our phase 3 watershed implementation plan identified a gap of $324 million a year in practice funding that we need and do not have currently. So we've been working on that. But the technical assistance piece, as was mentioned, is also a very big part of that. Part of the fear in actually getting some additional money, especially in a short period of time, like we're trying to reach the 2025 goal, is really the lack of capacity in getting that money out the door. And we need to strengthen our local conservation districts and all the private technical assistance providers and private partners that are out there working with farmers to get conservation on the ground, because as was mentioned before, it's a real bottleneck.
Well, I'd like
You
to,
touched on, go ahead, Bobby.
it's been a problem since agriculture began, and that's when you exceed the carrying capacity of your land, you got a problem. You either have to move on or you got to fix it. And quite frankly, all CAFOs, pretty much have exceeded the carrying capacity of their land. So what do we do about it? We've been plagued by this. So I just want to say that out front. And also I would like to say that our regional, because we're a multi-state issue, we have been blessed with more funds to get things done. It's like a big lever to help us get more funding. And we have gotten more funding because of our, the partnership, Rich, that you talked about, that's been a huge blessing to us. And the third thing I'd like to say is, or ask the question, if we could delist all of our local TMDLs, would we have a Chesapeake Bay TMDL? I don't think we would. It'd be restored.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's right. I think, just cutting back to what Marel was saying a moment ago. Marel, I thought you touched on 3 very important points, which I want to underscore for all of those who are listening out there, because these are points that I think have value in understanding elsewhere. First of all, Pennsylvania has no Chesapeake Bay waterfront, so that creates an immediate political problem. Why should we spend a lot of money cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay? As Marel rightly points out, the sales pitch there, even though they are basically, they got 33,000 farmers discharging into the Susquehanna River, which goes down to the Chesapeake Bay. They have some responsibility for managing that waste properly, but we try to sell it by talking about drinking water benefits, recreational benefits, all of the kind of the local benefits, as Marel said. But that problem is a significant one. The second one is the political geography, where the Susquehanna watershed is in the center of the state. On the west side, you have Pittsburgh and that area. On the east side, you have Philadelphia and its area. So the most of the population in your legislature really doesn't have the Susquehanna as their constituents. The third is the funding shortfall, and that flows directly from the second. In other words, if you don't have the support in the legislature, it's hard to get the local funds. Marel, quick wrap-up question, because we're running a little bit behind. What are the prospects for getting some additional funding for Pennsylvania this year?
So we are really working hard and seem to be getting some traction on using some of the federal American Rescue Plan funds that have come to Pennsylvania for some new and existing water-related programs, primarily for agricultural cost share, but also some acid mine drainage, a little bit of stormwater as well. I'm really putting that toward non-point source projects specifically, but again, statewide. We're asking for about $250 million out of the $5 billion that is currently unspoken for of that ARPA money in Pennsylvania for those non-point source projects. And again, some people say, well, you have such a big shortfall. Why are you only asking for 250 million? And again, it's really the capacity issue. We need to be sure that once we have the money, that we can actually get it out the door in an efficient and meaningful way.
Thanks, Marel. Let's just, we're going to jump very quickly to the accountability framework and just spend a couple of minutes on it because we're a little bit behind and we want to cover some other important topics. You all remember in my opening view, I talked about the accountability framework, which is unique to this TMDL and has been very important. It's got the deadlines, the WIPs, watershed implementation plans, the 2-year milestones, and the backstops. Rich, how is that working? What has been the success and failure in the use of the accountability framework?
So Rich, I think the first piece is that no other TMDL of the size and complexity that we put together here in the Chesapeake included an accountability framework. So as you recall, EPA published the Chesapeake Bay TMDL in 2010 on behalf of the 6 states in the district and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. 99.9% of the decisions in that TMDL, from the allocations to the detailed things that went into our models and our assumptions, were made by partners. Actually, in the accountability framework actually came from Governor Tim Kaine, now Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia. He actually brought that to the Executive Council and said in 2007, I'm a 4-year governor. You all might be 8-year governors. We need to have something that's going to keep us, our states, our commonwealths accountable for this point forward. They came forward with it. The partnership, not EPA, the partnership put the flesh on the bones, said 2-year milestones. We want to have an interim goal for the of 2017, 60% of the way, final time period by 2025. But the most important piece was EPA, you need to take a center role in here. We've got 6 states in the district. We just heard about Pennsylvania. When one state's lagging behind, that makes it extremely difficult for the surrounding upstream, downstream, and overstream states to proceed forward. So they said, EPA, you've got a role to play in terms of being a referee among the 6 states in the district, and you've got to hold those states accountable to those 2-year milestones, to their 2017 interim target, and their 2025 goal itself. So that all looked good. We built it into the TMDL. EPA issued something I never would have thought in my career, and that was, we called it a federal consequences. And that is, here's the action that the agency can take within the Clean Water Act if one of the states has fallen behind on its 2-year milestones or making progress towards its goals. Here's the steps the agency can take in the terms of funding, in terms of increased enforcement, in terms of water quality standards, regulations, a whole host of things. Then you proceed forward to 2012, when we clearly had evidence that Pennsylvania and even our New York partners were falling behind on their milestones, not being fully accountable in terms of their watershed implementation plans, and ultimately not on track to meet the 2025 goals. Unfortunately, the agency looked at that and they stepped back and they didn't take the action that I think the states and the governors agreed to back in 2007, got built into the 2010. And it wasn't just under the Obama administration. Regional administrators in both of those administrations had times, not just Pennsylvania, but other jurisdictions as well, that they should have taken action under that agreed to accountability framework. That was going to be one of the differences, along with those watershed implementation plans, that was going to truly make the 64,000 square mile, 7 jurisdiction TMDL different than the 50 or 60 or 70,000 have been put out there. Doesn't mean that it hasn't caused us to derail, but it certainly has not put the pressure where it's necessary to then give the protection assignment to those jurisdictions like Virginia, like Maryland, like West Virginia moving forward.
Marel, how would backstops work in Pennsylvania?
So we have had an example of a backstop. At one point back in 2016, EPA did withhold some grant funding. I think it was actually only like $2 million or so from Pennsylvania until some more enforcement and accountability was built into our agricultural programs. And that led to quite a bit of changes. We actually created, I should say DEP created a Bay office specifically in the agency, which had not been there before. It renegotiated the contracts that the agency has with local conservation districts to not just, fund Bay-related technical support, but actually to go out and do inspections of farms, which was a brand new role for conservation districts in Pennsylvania, and one that they did not embrace easily. Going from the, white hat helpful person to now someone who is going to be coming onto your farm with an inspection and someone enforcement role. So just that level of oversight from EPA did create some pretty significant changes in Pennsylvania. So the threat of ratcheting down wastewater treatment plants even further than they have been definitely hangs over the whole program, and has also helped to engage a lot of folks who might not necessarily be representing agricultural areas per se, but it has helped to keep the pressure on agriculture, because folks don't want it coming back onto another sector. So we have seen that threat, even though that trigger hasn't been pulled. It's out there, and it definitely has helped keep things moving forward to the extent that they have.
That's good. I think most of us feel that the accountability framework has been a very important part of what's been achieved under this TMDL. And Marel, would you take us into our next issue, which is verification issues? There have been challenges in making sure, for example, that best management practices on the ground actually translate into water quality benefits, which can be measured and verified, as well as just overall inspection, verification, compliance assurance, and enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about those issues for us?
Yeah, so there could be a whole other segment on just the modeling that goes into the evaluation of the actions that are being taken and the decisions that have been made as far as the assigning of the targets that everybody's trying to meet. But we are essentially reporting to the watershed model, and that's what everybody's chasing. We're chasing credit in that model. We're chasing the practices and the programs that are going to get us reductions per the model. And that's really helpful, because obviously the model helps us look forward. If we do this, we can expect this. And it's, an enormously sophisticated tool that has become even more sophisticated over time. And the latest iteration is, like I said, it could take up an entire segment of its own. But in order to get credit, that credit that we're chasing, we have to know what practices are out there and where they are, and are they actually functioning? And that takes a whole other level. We talked about, the manpower needed to work individually with farmers to get practices on the ground. It really takes a whole other group of folks to be out there, record keeping and capturing those practices, making sure that they are in a database, they're not duplicated, across multiple databases and things like that, to make sure that it's accurate what each state is reporting. And for the most part, a lot of those practices get captured through cost share programs, whether it's, those federal USDA conservation programs, or whether it's a state cost share program. That provides a really good way to get that paperwork, that paper trail of where these practices are, when they were implemented, et cetera. And in a state like Pennsylvania, without a really robust cost share program of its own, a lot of practices are out there, but they might not necessarily meet, the definition, the full definition of what a practice should look like. If they're not cost shared, we might not know where they are. We don't know when they were implemented, and tracking that information down has definitely been a challenge. And a lot of things have improved. Some of the funding now is going toward better data and record keeping here in Pennsylvania to capture all of that. But yeah, if you implemented it, but it's not in the model, it's like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, did it make a sound? If a practice gets implemented, but no one's there to record it, did it make a difference? That's our challenge right now. Thankfully, there's a pretty extensive monitoring network that helps tell us if the model is tracking with what's actually happening out there on the ground. But yeah, that is one challenge that the TMDL created, was sort of this chase of credits.
Marel, let me ask you to elaborate on that. What are you referring to when you speak of credits? Why is it important to get credits?
A credit translates ultimately to, a pound of phosphorus or nitrogen or sediment, but you have to record a practice, and then a practice is worth a certain reduction, and it's expressed in, a percent of reduction for whatever your underlying land use is, and what the underlying load is understood to be from that particular land use. Then you get sort of percent reduction credit.
So,
It's not like this all could be its own
well, I remember when CREP came to Virginia, there was one size fits all. You had to put in 35 feet of buffer or no go. And the farmers.
Bobby, tell us what CREP stands for.
That's the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and I think every Bay state has one.
Yep.
And it's a partnership between the state and the Farm Service Agency of USDA to put in buffers and exclude livestock from streams. At least that's the way it is in Virginia. But that, it's all evolved so nicely. We started out with 35 feet, and now, we had a 10-foot program with the state, and we had the private funders funded, a fence right on top of the bank. We just need to get the cows out of the streams, and there's all a sundry of ways to do it. And how do you capture the reduction for each of those? That's what's so complicated, and it takes a partnership to do it.
So Rich, I want to be sure that
Where it goes to Rich.
that it looks at bean counting. So in the Chesapeake watershed, we're probably the only 6-state watershed that actually does the accounting that we've got here. And it's not just to count the beans or to feed the model. It is to then match it up with, are you putting enough practices on the ground to change water quality in your local streams and rivers that change the levels to the Chesapeake, that then say, hey, I'm feeding back, and it's to the Whitescarvers that are out there working at a small scale, or the Lancaster counties, to then say, what have you got in place? How effective it is to your local waters? And then how much more do you need to do? Morel's correct. It is a change in mindset, but you're investing private dollars, you're investing federal, state, local dollars. Don't you want to know that it's working right? And don't you want to connect it up with the hard data, which is monitoring at hundreds of sites throughout those thousands of miles of streams and rivers? So it allows us to do things not just to credit or to debit Pennsylvania, but to make smarter decisions at a very local scale and at a 6-state watershed-wide scale.
That's a really good wrap up on that point, Rich. I'm going to turn next to climate change, which, in addition to being a timely topic, is critically important because it's an example of something that was not fully appreciated when the TMDL was issued back in 2010. What we're seeing, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, has been rising sea levels, flooding of communities, more severe weather events, and this has been particularly devastating. 2 of the last 3 years, we've had very heavy rains. The runoff has carried sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus into the bay. It has been estimated that at this point going forward, about 5 million more pounds of nitrogen are going into the bay due to climate change related activities, these unusual storm events, which are the new normal now. In addition, the contaminated runoff coupled with warmer weather is killing off the sensitive bay grasses. That's very important because the bay grasses provide habitat for aquatic organisms and birds, aquatic organisms, especially right at the base of the food chain. So the result of this is that the Bay States have gotten together, following exactly the model that Rich described earlier. They got together and said, what are we going to do about this? Our existing watershed implementation plans are not adequate to address it. So they took a look at it. They all amended their watershed implementation plans, and they're now putting into place practices designed first mitigate the effects of climate change. If we can't mitigate them, let's get more resilient to deal with them. So that's a real quick overview of what we're seeing in climate change, but it has meant a major mid-course correction in the overall restoration effort. Any of the panelists want to add anything? Bobby, how's this affecting selection of BMPs? That's perhaps one thing we ought to talk about. In other words, it may be driving the priority for some kind of BMPs that not only reduce nitrogen and phosphorus runoff, but sequester carbon.
Well, I mean, this is a great topic, and I know that many states are creating soil health initiatives, and I know Virginia has a soil health, initiative, and we're trying right now to come up with a suite of practices that sequester carbon. So, there's 2 ways to reduce the greenhouse gases. One is to stop emitting them, or reduce the emissions, and second is to capture what's in there and put it back in the soil. The soil is the largest terrestrial carbon sink on the planet, and we can use plants to do the job, and we can use farmers to put those plants back in the ground. And I'll give you a real simple example. If you're growing corn and you harvest the ear, that corn stalk needs to stay on the land. We call that a crop residue use. So that stalk is full of carbon. And I just cringe when I drive around and see baled up corn stalks, that has little feed value. Now it might have some value as bedding, and they'll, use it for bedding and put, the manure in there and then land applied. But we can use plants to capture the carbon and put it back in the soil. And so if we reduce tillage, and if we increase the use of crop residues and we apply manure and compost, that goes a long way to getting the job done. And agriculture should be used in a big way to do that.
We're running short on time, and our last topic before we turn to Q&A is lessons learned for the future. And Chuck has just texted me that we've got a lot of good questions, so we want to get to that. Let's take 2 minutes, guys, and run through really quickly some of the important lessons we've learned. I'm going to start out by just saying one thing we've learned is the TMDL is the only tool, not just the most effective, the only tool under the Clean Water Act to address multi-state pollution problems, including watershed restoration. Rich, what do you have?
I would say a couple things. Accountability is critical, and fully enforcing it out there. Strong leadership and consistent leadership, not just at governor's levels, but mayors, scientists, business people out there is an important one. Getting that long-term funding so that it's shared funding, so that your partners can move around, and somebody needs to fill a hole in terms of a program, or you're missing a monitoring program. And transparency, Ridge, to be transparent, to allow your data, your information out there, to deliver good news and deliver bad news, and also deliver news that means you need to adapt your program.
Okay, Bobby, what do you got? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, I think for me, a partnership and a regional approach has worked very well, and getting along together and then moving forward. And then secondly, building trust with farmers is going to get the job done.
Marel?
Certainly having all the science and the data and the understanding of not just the bay, but the watershed has just been enormously helpful in developing meaningful policy. Folks don't want to take action just for the sake of taking action. You know, they want it to be meaningful and know that what they're doing is going to have an impact. And like I said, having the enormous amount of knowledge that we have has been extremely helpful. And then also just focusing at that local level and having your actions mean something at, you know, the local stream level really creates public engagement. That's where folks will engage. The bay is too big, but their local neighborhood stream is where it's at, and that's where you'll get the biggest commitment
And
from
Rich,
folks.
before we move on, just to have folks understand, everything you heard from my three partners here, it's working out there. The dead zone shrinking, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads to the Chesapeake are going down. Underwater grasses hit their high 2 or 3 years ago before those rains came in there. Rockfish are having a hard time, but they've been back. Oysters are coming back, crabs. It's not perfect out there, but we've seen in our respective careers things that I never expected to see. When we moved from 12 million people when I started in 1985 to over 19 million now, we've got more than a 50% increase in human population. We've gone back on that footprint and actually taken it back a little bit further. So it is working out there. We're not done, but that collective effort of everything you've heard today is making a visible difference that I've seen to my neighbors, farmers out in West Virginia, watermen on the eastern shore of Maryland.
We're going to turn to questions now. And the first one that I've got right up here is, if all the TMDL goals are achieved, that's all the water quality goals are achieved, will that mean that the bay has been adequately restored? Or will such a restoration mean that the fauna and flora of the bay have been restored to some previous level that signifies restoration? Let me step back and say that in 2009, Barack Obama issued an executive order declaring the Chesapeake Bay a national treasure and directing 7 federal agencies at that time to work with state and the private sector to restore the quality of the bay, not just the water quality, but the habitat, the fish, the animals, the plants, the whole watershed. And so just while cleaning up the water quality and meeting the TMDL is the big enchilada, and a lot of the, obviously, if you clean up the water, the fish, the oysters, and a lot of other critters are going to improve as well. Bay grasses, that. But there is a broader question about habitat. We didn't get a chance to talk about this, but in 2014, all the Bay partners entered into an agreement called the Bay Watershed Agreement, in which they recommitted to the goals of the TMDL and the broader habitat restoration goals of Obama's executive order. And so the partnership is actually tracking those as well through teams and work groups. I'm going to just turn to another one that came in. Are there opportunities to submit proposals for grants for cleanup approaches for non-point source issues or CAFO issues? If so, who would be the best to contact to get additional information? Bobby, do you want to take a start on that?
Well, I know some things about that. The NRCS has grants, available, all kinds of grants to private nonprofits, and of course all the cost share programs. But the state's Department of Conservation and Recreation have Clean Water Act 319 grants available. It's always been my belief that if anybody wants to improve water quality, there's money out there somewhere, and you just have to look. It's out there. National Fish and Wildlife Federation has funds. It's been, just a wealth of wealth out there to help people improve water quality.
Marel, you want to add anything to that?
So yeah, Bobby mentioned National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Their Chesapeake Bay Stewardship Fund has two separate grant programs. One smaller, up to $500,000 per project, and one up to $1 million. Now they both require matching funds, as you know, most grant programs do. So that's something that's available Baywide. In Pennsylvania, we actually have a tax credit program for farmers to implement agricultural BMPs, and that tax credit is transferable. So if the farmer can't use it themselves, a business or someone else with tax liability can come in and purchase that credit and get the write-off for themselves. And we actually need some more demand for the transfer of those credits. The credits themselves, that program's oversubscribed, excuse me, every year, up to $13 million. But getting the demand for the transfer of those credits, we could actually use some more of.
I think that's very helpful. Most states in the area have soil conservation districts, which can be helpful to farmers in particular on that. The next question is, what is the role of the two interstate river commissions in the Bay cleanup? That's the Susquehanna River Basin Commission and the Potomac River Basin Commission. Who'd like to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, Jeff, I could. Actually, they're both extremely important. So you've got your two major watersheds, the Susquehanna and the Potomac. They have different mandates from Congress, but they both are active in terms of our monitoring programs. They bring the kind of science and technical information that Marel may mention to the states that are members of those commissions, but also to the localities that are out there. So they're actively in our partnership at different levels in terms of our technical, programmatic, and policy sides.
Here's a rather pessimistic question. A Smithsonian oyster researcher told me that it is hopeless to expect Chesapeake oysters to recover because they are suffering from all of the silt. What is your response? Well, I'll just start by saying silt tends to be more of a problem up in the upper part of the bay, where you get some of the major river deposits, particularly storms coming over the Conowingo Dam from the Susquehanna. It's a problem elsewhere, but it certainly is not going to by itself be the death of the oysters. Who else would like to comment on that?
Yeah, we used to be at about 1% of what we saw in the 1800s. So that's not too good, but we're actually heading towards 2%, which is a positive. And that is because there's been habitat restoration, Ridge, as you're saying, in Maryland, Virginia. They're rebuilding oyster reefs into three-dimensional systems where they're higher up in the water column. They're away from those bottom sediments. So yeah, do we have too much silt? Absolutely. Just ask the bay grasses. Are oysters making a way back? They certainly are. And I'm glad for it because I like oysters on the half shell on my plate as well.
There's also incentives for
like
aquaculture, oyster aquaculture in both Maryland and Virginia. Bobby.
Well, I remember when the Lynn Haven River was so bad that, you couldn't harvest any oysters, or maybe there weren't any oysters. And now it's recovered, and we can actually, I've eaten Lynn Haven oysters in the Shenandoah Valley. Now that's a success story.
We actually heard a presentation just at our commission meeting last week, where actually in Virginia, they're up to about 4 to 5%, I think, of historic populations. And it's because of the aquaculture in particular. Again, they're up higher in the water column, which helps a lot. Yeah.
Got a message from Cornelius Carr to Marel recommending Pam Delicio, Pennsylvania State Rep, works across the aisle, very good contact in the House. I'll forward this to you, Marel, so you'll have it. This comes from Cornelius Carr.
Thanks. Yeah. Yes, I have met Representative Delicio over the years, and she always asks wonderful questions. So yeah, it's great. It's a good point. I will follow up with her.
Okay, next question. I was hoping to learn if we can save the bay. So far, we've heard a lot of process, but I wanted to hear what progress we have made and what the projections are. Let me just offer one statistic. I think there's Winston Churchill says there are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. But this one I think is worth keeping in mind. In 1983, the Bay watershed had a population of 12.7 million people. Now it's 18 million people, but the nitrogen levels have dropped by nearly 30%. That's progress. Now, we've picked most of the low-hanging fruit. Every year we get down, we reduce it more and more. There is actual progress. Who else would like to add on that?
Well, if I could share my screen very quickly. Hopefully this will come up. Are you seeing
Yeah.
a chart where
Yes.
nitrogen reductions are coming from? So yeah, so you can see to 2019, sort of the trend we've been on since we started all this back in 1985. And if we continue on that trend, we'll get where we need to be eventually. The question right now is, are we going to get there anytime soon, and specifically by the 2025 deadline? And that's what we're working toward right now, is really accelerating that trend line to get where we need to be by 2025.
And Ridge, it's not just the talking heads out there, but the scientific community and up in the watershed and in the tidal waters, they're seeing those trends out there. My neighbors are seeing more grasses out there. Folks in West Virginia are seeing a cleaner South Fork of the Shenandoah and a South Branch of the Potomac out there. People are actually seeing those differences. They're seeing the carpeting that Bobby mentioned on the Eastern Shore and in the Shenandoah of cover crops during the wintertime period out there. We're not there yet, but it's not just a small portion of it. There's large sections of people saying things are working out there. They're different than what we've seen. We've seen dolphins in the Chesapeake for the first time in probably decades, if not a century. That means there's cleaner water, more food up in this system as well. Mother Nature's telling us we're going in the right direction. Are we there yet? No. We got some big challenges with human behavior changes, like Bobby said, but there is clear evidence that collective working together of partners, state, federal, local, business, academic, non-governmental, it's working.
Well, I like to add that it's the small watersheds too. You can see people, volunteers and people working together to get their streams delisted. We have restored Pogue Run in the city of Stanton to where we're stocking with brook trout. And that was point source plus non-point source pollution, where everybody worked together. And another example is Middle River. We just delisted 23 miles of Middle River in the Shenandoah Valley. That's happening all over the watershed.
Several people have asked in the chat box here, what can I do to help? If I live in the area, what can I do to help? I'm mentioning just a couple things and then pass it around to others. There are all kinds of organizations, NGOs. In the Chesapeake Bay watershed, there's a group called the Choose Clean Water Coalition, which is about 250 organizations, everything from national groups that you would know, like American Rivers, Natural Resources Defense Council, down to regional groups like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Piedmont Environmental Council, to little local ones, Friends of Mattawoman Creek, Friends of Rock Creek. You can volunteer there. You go on the Choose Clean Water Coalition website, just Google them, or, they're the groups like the Potomac Conservancy, all around. There are all kinds of organizations, and they offer volunteer things, the kind of things I mentioned earlier, like stream bank revegetations, tree plantings, all of that kind of work can be done on a volunteer basis. We've just posted in the link, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's link to their recommendations for what individuals can do to help save the bay. What would others on the panel like to add?
I would say if you own a house, look around your yard. Are your downspouts dug in there into a French drain so you're not sending your stormwater to your neighbors there? Did you actually apply any fertilizer last year? Well, maybe just do it in the fall as opposed to winter. Are you planting some trees? Just take a look at your own surrounding area and then work with your neighborhood, your homeowners association, and see what you can do with your own piece of the world.
Yeah, if you have a lawn, test your soil. Usually you can do that through your land grant university, through your extension service. You can get a soil test kit. Do it. It's eye-opening to what your lawn may or may not need.
Here's a question on a topic we didn't talk about, but we'll try our hand at this. The question is, we now have a new concern of imminent nature, PFAS, PFOS, these are so-called forever chemicals that are cancer causing at very, very low levels and don't break down in the environment. Chesapeake Naval Lab has a stream that is feet from our property that feeds into the Chesapeake Bay. I had the stream tested with a reputable lab. It's over 6,000 parts per trillion. The European Union states that only 0.6 parts per trillion is safe. I don't know who's out there measuring parts per trillion down to the hundreds, but this is all going into the bay. The use of the firefighting foams, which is the source of PFOs, PFASs, has been going on since the 50s. Why isn't the Naval Lab required to filter the water? What can we do to solve this problem? Who'd like to take a crack at that? Well, I'll start off by mentioning that the Biden administration is aware of that and has a task force addressing that. Didn't start with the Biden administration. EPA has been looking at these so-called forever chemicals because you really have to stop them at the source, and you have to stop them from getting into our commerce. And they're everywhere. They're included in all kinds of products, and that's how they get into the waste stream. I can't tell you what the technology is, and I can't tell you what the institutional controls are, except to wean ourselves off the products that use these things. Who else has a thought on that?
Well, I mean, these substances really are everywhere and in almost everything. So yeah, firefighting foam is one significant source, but it's just amazing, from your food cans to your, it's amazing how much these are used in food processing and cooking and preparation, not to mention our clothes, our carpets, so all the way up to firefighting foam. Virginia has banned the use of these substances in firefighting foam for training purposes. Pennsylvania is looking at that legislation as well. It's been introduced the past 2 sessions. There was also some legislation last session to create a funding source for one particular cleanup project in Southeast Pennsylvania, which I think was a former military facility. So the awareness is definitely out there. I think having a standard, threshold will be helpful if we can get that established. And the governor here in Pennsylvania has had a task force looking at that as well.
So here's a comment. PFAS substances are even commonly found in cosmetics. That's absolutely right. We've got about 30 seconds left, and that gives us time for just one more question. If I can find a short one here. I've heard that lawns are the largest agricultural crop in acreage in the U.S. It seems that reducing lawn size or helping homeowners replace their lawns with native plants that grow or can be mowed to a 3-4 inch could go a long way. Bobby, it sounds like it's right in your wheelhouse.
Well, yeah. Try to reduce your lawn. Yeah, and don't fertilize it. You won't find any phosphorus in lawn fertilizer in Virginia. But yeah, by all means, plant native plants, plant trees, and reduce lawn size for sure.
Yeah, we figured that I think there's almost 3 million acres of turf grass in people's backyards and front yards. So they're the second largest agricultural source is our system. But Bobby's right that working with fertilizer groups through the Chesapeake Bay Commission, we've gotten phosphorus out of there and reduced amount of nitrogen. But yeah, certainly plant more plants and take out that grass.
Well, we're at the end of our time. I still see just a couple more questions in the chat box. I'm going to give you folks my email address. And if there's any of you out there who have a question that we didn't have time to answer and you'd like it answered, you can shoot me an email and I will do my best to get you an answer in consultation with our brain trust here. And the email address is ridgehall, RIDGEHALL @gmail.com. And with that, thank you all for staying with us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck Elkins.